They had one song, one moment, when everything clicked, when the radio played their name, and the world paid attention. And then, nothing. Labels took the money. Publishers took the credit. Covers made other people rich. And the men and women who created the original, who stood in the studio and gave everything they had to that one extraordinary performance, they went back to selling real estate, or working the circuit, or struggling through addiction, until there was nothing left at all. Tonight, 12 of them. Their songs, their stories, their real endings. Number 10, Nolan Strong, The Wind, 1954. Here is a name you probably don't know. Here is why you should. Nolan Strong was the lead vocalist of a Detroit doo-wop group called the Diablos, signed to Fortune Records, the small, family-run Detroit independent operated by Jack and Devorah Brown, in 1954. He had a voice of extraordinary purity and range, a high falsetto with an emotional delicacy that sounded completely unlike anything else being recorded in Detroit in the mid-1950s. That voice influenced a 13-year-old boy named Smokey Robinson. Robinson has said in interviews that Nolan Strong was his primary vocal influence, the sound he was trying to replicate when he was first learning to sing. Not Sam Cooke, not Clyde McPhatter. Nolan Strong, the man Berry Gordy later signed to Motown and built an empire around, had modeled his entire vocal approach on a Detroit singer from a tiny local independent label.
When a star falls, I wish.
The Wind, released in 1954, is the record most associated with Strong and the Diablos, a flowing, delicate piece of doo-wop that sounds like it was recorded by people who had been singing together since childhood and had developed an almost telepathic musical understanding. It became the group's only national charting single, but it remained deeply embedded in Detroit's musical culture for years, a record that the city's musicians and music lovers knew was extraordinary even when the rest of the country had moved on. Fortune Records never properly paid Nolan Strong. The Browns kept meticulous control of the label's catalog and finances, and the terms under which Strong and the Diablos recorded left them with almost no royalty income from their work.
The mountains and the valleys.
Strong spent his later years in near-total obscurity, his music largely unavailable, his contribution to the sound of American soul music unacknowledged in any meaningful public way.
Shall I still love you?
He died in 1977 in Detroit. He was 43 years old. When Smokey Robinson heard the news, Robinson was reportedly heartbroken, a man weeping for the singer who had taught him everything and received almost nothing for it.
I know she has got.
Number 9, Tommy Tucker, High Heel Sneakers, 1964. Robert Higginbotham, Tommy Tucker was his stage name, was born in Springfield, Ohio in 1933, one of 11 children. He taught himself piano, moved through Memphis and Chicago and eventually New York, and in early 1964 walked into a recording session for the chess subsidiary Checker Records and cut High Heel Sneakers, a driving, insistent blues shuffle built on his own boogie-woogie piano and a lyric full of specific sartorial detail. Put on your high heel sneakers, wear your wig hat on your head. The song hit number 11 on the Billboard Hot 100 and number 1 on the R&B chart. And then, in a pattern that should be familiar from every other entry on this countdown, the follow-up records didn't hit. Tucker tried for years. He worked with Bo Diddley on comeback albums in the mid-1970s. He had genuine musical conversations happening throughout his career, but the commercial momentum of High Heel Sneakers never returned. Here is the detail that says everything. Tommy Tucker eventually left the music industry entirely and took a job as a real estate agent in New Jersey. He also freelanced as a writer for a local newspaper in East Orange, writing about, in his own documented words, the plight and ignorance of black males in America, and the gullibility and exploitation of black artists. He had lived that story firsthand, and he was writing about it in his spare time as a real estate agent, while high-heel sneakers was being covered by Elvis Presley, Tom Jones, Stevie Wonder, Jerry Lee Lewis, and over 200 other artists worldwide. On January 22, 1982, Tommy Tucker died at 48 years old at College Hospital in Newark, New Jersey. The cause was accidental inhalation of toxic carbon tetrachloride fumes while he was refinishing the hardwood floors of his own home. He was doing his own home maintenance because he was a real estate agent. The man who wrote a song covered 200 times died refinishing his own floors at 48. Number 8. Jimmy Soul, If You Wanna Be Happy, 1963. James McLeese, born in Weldon, North Carolina in 1942, raised in Portsmouth, Virginia, singing in church from childhood. He performed gospel in the Norfolk area as a teenager and was eventually signed to Sprue QR Records, a small imprint distributed through SPQR Music in New York, where he recorded a song based on an old Trinidadian calypso called Ugly Woman, reworked and rewritten by Frank Guida, the same producer who had scored hits with Gary U.S. Bonds. The result was, If You Want to Be Happy for the Rest of Your Life, a cheerfully cynical piece of advice set to a bouncy calypso groove, with soul's gospel-trained exuberance, making the whole thing feel both genuinely funny and irresistibly listenable. It hit number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in the spring of 1963 and stayed there for 2 weeks. It remains one of the most immediately recognizable pop soul records of the entire early 1960s, a song so catchy that it has appeared in commercials, films, and television programs for 6 decades. The contractual terms under which Soul had recorded the song were not favorable. Say QR was a small operation, and the distribution arrangements that sent the record to number 1 did not generate proportionate financial returns to the artist. Soul had follow-up records that failed to chart at similar levels, and the commercial momentum of If You Want to Be Happy dissipated without building the foundation that a genuine chart topper should have provided. Jimmy Soul died on June 25, 1988, in Portsmouth, Virginia. He was 45 years old. He had spent the years since his number 1 hit performing locally, largely unable to capitalize on or even fully receive the commercial value his one major recording had generated. The man who told the world the secret to happiness, in a song that still plays everywhere, died at 45, having found very little of it for himself. If you're locked into this one, most people scrolling past these songs have no idea what it took to make them. We digs that history back up, one record at a time. The subscribe button costs nothing, and it means you won't miss the next one. Number 7. Chris Kenner, I Like It Like That, 1961. Chris Kenner was born in Kenner, Louisiana in 1929, a small town on the outskirts of New Orleans that shares his family name, though the connection is historical rather than documented lineage. He grew up in New Orleans, sang gospel, and by the late 1950s had established himself as a songwriter and performer on the New Orleans R&B scene. He signed to Instant Records, the label run by New Orleans producer and entrepreneur Joe Banashak, and in 1961 released I Like It Like That, a driving, percussive, irresistibly fun piece of New Orleans soul with a call-and-response chorus that sounded like a party invitation set to music.
Show you where it's at. Come on, let me show you where it's at.
The song hit number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100, stopped only by Tossin' and Turnin' by Bobby Lewis at the peak of that song's run.
Come on, let me show you where it's at. Come on.
In 1965, the Dave Clark Five took their own rock version of Kenner's song to the top 5 on the pop chart, generating substantial commercial activity from a song that Kenner had written and originally recorded. He received almost none of that commercial benefit.
The place, I like it like that. Now the last time I was down there.
Kenner's personal life was marked by legal trouble. In 1968, he was arrested on a charge of contributing to the delinquency of a minor. He was convicted and served time, a conviction that damaged his professional reputation and his ability to rebuild a music career in any systematic way.
The name of the place, I like it like that.
He continued performing in New Orleans when he could, continuing to be embraced by the city's musical community that understood his contribution to the local sound, regardless of his legal history.
And all there was go, man, go, come on.
Chris Kenner died on January 25, 1976, in New Orleans. He was 46 years old. He died essentially broke. The financial returns from both his own original recordings and the commercially successful covers of his songs having largely evaded him.
Let me show you where it's at. The name of the place is I like it like.
A man who wrote and recorded one of the most joyful records in New Orleans soul history died at 46 without the resources to reflect that joy.
Come on, let me show you where it's at. I want to show you. Come on.
Number 6, Wilbert Harrison, Kansas City, 1959.
I come.
Here is what it cost to record the biggest hit of Wilbert Harrison's career: $40 and 15 minutes of studio time. That is documented fact. A $40 recording session at Bell Sound Studios in New York City in March 1959, recorded for Bobby Robinson's independent Fury Records label. The song was Kansas City, written by Jerry Lieber and Mike Stoller, and Harrison's version, with his casually confident vocal and the propulsive rhythm track behind him, hit number 1 on the pop chart for 2 weeks and spent 7 consecutive weeks at number 1 on the R&B chart. It sold over 1 million copies.
They got some crazy little women there and I'm gonna.
Here is what Harrison received for it: the royalties from a Fury Records contract, structured as most independent label contracts of that era were structured, which is to say in a way that heavily favored the label over the artist.
But if I have to walk, I'm going.
The Beatles covered Kansas City. James Brown covered it. The song became one of the most recognized recordings of the early rock and roll era and was inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame in 2001.
I'm gonna get me one.
Wilbert Harrison spent the rest of his career unable to build commercial momentum comparable to that one $40 afternoon. He had a modest follow-up success in 1970 with Let's Work Together, which reached the pop top 40, suggesting the talent was always there. The commercial infrastructure was not. He performed as a solo act through the 1970s and into the 1980s, supplementing the meager returns from live performance with whatever other income he could find. According to the Grokopedia biography of Harrison, based on documented historical sources, he had battled poverty throughout much of his life, which compounded his challenges in later years.
Kansas City, here I come.
On October 26, 1994, Wilbert Harrison suffered a stroke and died in a nursing home in Spencer, North Carolina. He was 65 years old. The song that cost $40 to record is still playing. The man who recorded it died in a nursing home with almost nothing. Number 5, Rosie Hamlin, Angel Baby, 1960. Rosie Hamlin was 14 years old when she wrote Angel Baby. 14. She was living in San Diego with her family. Her father was in the Navy, and she wrote the song at home on the family piano, a slow, dreaming, deeply personal love ballad with a lyric so guileless and so sincere that it could only have been written by someone that young and that unguarded about what they felt. Her father helped her record a demo. The demo reached a small local label called Highland Records, which pressed a limited regional release. The record began attracting attention on San Diego radio almost immediately. Enough attention that it was picked up for national distribution, where it reached number 5 on the Billboard Hot 100 in early 1961 and number 12 on the R&B chart, a remarkable commercial performance for a record that had started as a teenage girl's home demo. Here is what Highland Records did with the publishing rights to the song. They took them, standard practice for a small independent label dealing with an unrepresented 14-year-old and her Navy father in 1960. The publishing, the portion of the song's income that comes from every cover version, every use in film or television, every mechanical license, was registered in ways that did not benefit Rosie Hamlin or her family. John Lennon reportedly said, "Angel Baby was his favorite American record. It has been covered dozens of times. The royalties from many of those covers went elsewhere." Hamlin continued recording through the 1960s and 1970s without achieving comparable commercial success. She spent much of her later life fighting for recognition of her songwriting contribution and for financial returns from a song she had written alone as a 14-year-old. Rosie Hamlin died on December 28, 2008, in Redding, California. She was 63 years old. She had received, by her own account over decades of interviews, a fraction of what Angel Baby had generated. Number 4. Lyndell, What a Man, 1968. Lyndell recorded What a Man at the Stax Records facility in Memphis in 1968, backed by the Stax session musicians who had played on records by Otis Redding, Sam and Dave, and most of the other landmark recordings in the label's catalog. The song is a declaration, direct, joyful, unambiguous, of a woman's appreciation for the man she loves. Lyndell's vocal is confident and warm. The rhythm section locks in with the authority that made Stax recordings physically impossible to stand still through. What a Man reached number 63 on the pop chart and number 23 on the R&B chart when Stax's Volt subsidiary released it in 1968. It was a solid showing, but not the breakthrough it should have been. Stax, which was facing its own internal tensions and contractual complications with Atlantic Records around this period, did not give the record the full promotional support it deserved. Lyndell never had another chart entry of comparable significance. And then, in 1993, something happened that permanently repositioned What a Man in the cultural landscape, without positioning Lyndell in any comparable way. Salt-N-Pepa sampled What a Man for their own single Shoop, and then released a song specifically titled What a Man, that interpolated and built on Lyndell's original recording, becoming a worldwide pop hit and one of the defining songs of early 1990s hip-hop. The commercial activity generated by that sample and interpolation was enormous. Lyndell's share of it, for years, was extremely limited. She has spoken in interviews about the experience of watching a song she recorded in Memphis in 1968 become globally famous through other people's work, while she received almost none of the financial benefit. It was only through sustained advocacy for her rights that she eventually received some recognition. Linda Lyndell died in 2024. She had waited a long time for the acknowledgement she deserved.
What a man, what a man, what a man, what a mighty, mighty good man.
Number 3. Linda Jones, Hypnotized, 1967.
Hypnotized.
Linda Jones was born in Newark, New Jersey in 1944 into a deeply musical gospel family, the Jones Singers, a family group she performed with from the age of 6. By the mid-1960s, she had graduated to professional performing, making her way through the New Jersey and New York club circuit with a voice that stopped audiences dead, a full-throttled, gospel-trained instrument with a distinctive tremolo that singers who heard her described as almost impossible to imitate. In 1967, producer George Kerr brought her into the studio for a session at Loma Records, a Warner Brothers subsidiary, and had her record a song called Hypnotized. Here is the detail most people don't know. Jones was still learning the lyrics when Kerr quietly told the engineer to hit record.
My heart is yours to go.
She sang through it unrehearsed, even mispronouncing the title word as hypnotized instead of hypnotized. Kerr refused to redo it. He knew, correctly, that the rawness and the specific quality of someone singing a song for the very first time was already the finished record. The mispronunciation stayed. The song hit number 4 on the R&B chart. Jones had been managing insulin-dependent diabetes her entire life, a condition that she controlled with injections while maintaining a punishing touring schedule. There was no safety net. No infrastructure to manage her health around the demands of the road. She performed because performing was how she earned, and she earned because there was no other income to fall back on. In March 1972, Linda Jones was 2 weeks into an engagement at the Apollo Theater in Harlem, a career peak run at the most important soul venue in America. She performed the matinee show. She went home to her mother's house in Newark to rest before the evening show. She went into a diabetic coma. She was rushed to hospital and never regained consciousness. Linda Jones died on March 14, 1972. She was 27 years old. The evening show never happened. The royalties from her work were minimal. She left almost nothing behind except a voice on a record that should have been the beginning of a long career. Number 2. Nathaniel Mayer, Village of Love, 1962. Nathaniel Mayer was a Detroit-based R&B singer who recorded for Fortune Records, the same small independent that had housed Nolan Strong and the Diablos. He released Village of Love in 1962, a charged, raw, wildly enthusiastic piece of early Detroit soul funk that hit number 22 on the pop chart and became a cult favorite on the Northern Soul circuit in Britain, where DJs discovered it on record-buying trips to the United States and introduced it to British working-class dancers who played it repeatedly at all-night sessions. Like virtually every Fortune Records artist, Mayer received almost nothing from the commercial activity Village of Love generated. The label's accounting practices, the structure of its contracts, and the broader patterns of independent label exploitation that characterized the early 1960s music business combined to ensure that the artist who created the record saw a fraction of its value. What followed was 4 decades of obscurity. Nathaniel Mayer essentially disappeared from the music business. The Northern Soul circuit kept playing Village of Love. Record collectors in England paid increasing prices for original pressings. The song became more famous among a specific, devoted audience, while its creator was nowhere to be found. In the early 2000s, Mayer was rediscovered, tracked down, in his late 60s, living in Detroit, having spent decades in and out of extremely difficult circumstances. He made a remarkable comeback album, I Just Want to Be Held, in 2004 for Fat Possum Records, which was critically acclaimed and introduced him to a new generation of listeners. He performed with renewed energy and genuine joy at what had happened to him after so long. Nathaniel Mayer died on June 22, 2008, in Detroit, Michigan. He was 66 years old. He had his comeback. He had his recognition. He got it late, and he got it briefly. But Village of Love, 46 years old when he died, was still playing. He died knowing that. Number 1. Frankie Lymon, Why Do Fools Fall in Love, 1956. William Lymon, born in Washington Heights, Manhattan, in 1942. His father was a member of a gospel group called the Harlemers, and Frankie grew up singing in church, with the genetic inheritance of someone built to be a vocal performer. By 1955, at 13 years old, he had replaced the lead singer of a vocal group called the Premiers, who renamed themselves the Teenagers, and was performing at dances and amateur nights in Harlem with a voice that reduced audiences to silence. The song that changed everything was written by Frankie's bandmate Herman Santiago, with contributions from fellow teenager Jimmy Merchant. They called it, Why Do Fools Fall in Love? The group's producer, George Goldner at G Records, heard it and immediately recognized its potential. He also recognized that Frankie Lymon's voice, not yet broken, hovering at the precise intersection of boy and man, was the element that made it extraordinary. When the record was pressed, the credited songwriters were Frankie Lymon and George Goldner, not Herman Santiago, who wrote it, not Jimmy Merchant, who contributed to it. Goldner, who had not written a word, credited himself and gave Lymon co-credit to give the arrangement plausibility. Herman Santiago and Jimmy Merchant were left off entirely. Why Do Fools Fall in Love hit number 6 on the Billboard Hot 100 and number 1 on the R&B chart in 1956. Frankie Lymon was 13 years old. He became the first black teenage pop star in American history. He toured America and Europe. His face was on magazine covers. The label and its ownership structure, controlled by the infamous Morris Levy, a figure with documented organized crime connections, ensured that the royalties from millions of records sold went where Morris Levy determined they would go, which was not to Frankie Lymon. By his own account, in a 1967 Ebony magazine interview, Lymon had been introduced to heroin at 15 by a woman twice his age. An addict is the most pathetic creature on earth, he told the magazine. He knows that every time he sticks a needle in his arm, he's gambling with death, and yet he's got to have it. On February 27, 1968, Frankie Lymon was found dead on the floor of his grandmother's bathroom in Harlem, a syringe beside him. He was 25 years old. He was penniless. He had been booked for a recording session that same day, a comeback that never happened. 3 women later claimed to be his widow. Diana Ross covered Why Do Fools Fall in Love in 1981 and triggered a decade of legal battles over royalties that went to lawyers and label successors, and ultimately to anyone except the people who had created the song. The boy who had been the first black teenage pop star in America died alone and broke at 25 in his grandmother's bathroom. He left nothing. The song plays on.